The day we moved into Maplewood Lane, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. The moving truck groaned as it pulled up to our new house, its tires crunching over gravel that looked like it hadn't seen much action in years. It was a modest two-story home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac with a small front yard and fresh paint on the walls. Not perfect, but ours. Daniel, my husband, had been thrilled when he found this place online. A fresh start, he'd said, his eyes lighting up. But for me, something about the neighborhood felt off. As we unloaded boxes, a woman appeared from next door as if out of nowhere. She wore neatly pressed khakis and a cardigan despite the summer heat, her hair styled into a tight bun. Her smile seemed warm at first glance, but there was something sharp behind it, like she was sizing us up. "Welcome to Maplewood," she said cheerfully, holding out a thick packet wrapped in plastic. "I'm Nancy Whitmore, president of the Homeowners Association. These are the community guidelines. You'll want to familiarize yourself with them." Guidelines. The packet was heavier than it looked, filled with pages upon pages of rules. I flipped through it while standing there, trying not to let my confusion show. No bright-colored doors. No clotheslines visible from the street. No lawn ornaments taller than 3 feet. Even the mailbox had specific requirements about paint color and how far it should stick out from the curb. Daniel chuckled when I showed him later. "Relax, Em," he said, brushing sawdust off his hands after assembling a bookshelf. "It's just paperwork. People make a big deal out of nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just paperwork. Something about Nancy's tight grin stuck with me. She didn't just hand over the rules. She watched us as she did it, like she was waiting for us to slip up already. And the neighborhood itself. Quiet, yes, but almost too quiet. The houses were close together, their windows reflecting back every move we made. At night, I kept imagining eyes watching us from those dark panes. Still, we tried to settle in. We painted the living room a soft sage green, hung family photos, and unpacked our belongings. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass, and birds chirped in the trees. But then, one morning, I found a note slipped under our front door. It was printed on official-looking paper, stamped with the HOA logo. Asterisk, dear residents, asterisk. Asterisk, we have received reports of non-compliant window treatments, sheer curtains. Please refer to Section 3.2 of your HOA handbook for approved materials. Asterisk. Sheer curtains. Really? They weren't even visible unless you stood right outside our bedroom window, which, apparently, someone had done. I stared at the note, my stomach sinking. Who cared about curtains? Who had time to notice such tiny details? I crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash, irritated. Daniel tried to calm me down. "Maybe they're just strict because they care," he offered, though he didn't sound convinced himself. But I couldn't help wondering, did they really care? Or was this something else entirely? The days turned into weeks, and life in Maplewood Lane settled into a rhythm. Quiet, predictable, and suffocating. The neighborhood was eerily silent, save for the occasional hum of lawnmowers or distant chatter from children playing on the other side of the development. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. It was the kind that made you hyper-aware of every sound you made, like the creak of floorboards or the slam of a car door. Every little noise seemed to echo, drawing attention you didn't want. Daniel threw himself into work, leaving early and coming home late most days. He said he loved the house, loved how spacious it felt compared to our old apartment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way the neighbors always seemed to be watching, or maybe it was the growing pile of notes showing up under our door. After the sheer curtains incident, another note arrived. This time, it was about our welcome mat, a cheerful red one with "Home Sweet Home" stitched across it. Apparently, it was too bold for Maplewood standards. Bold? A welcome mat. I stared at the note, my jaw tightening. Who even cared about a piece of fabric meant to wipe dirt off shoes? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just nitpicking, but the tension built steadily inside me. Each note felt less like a suggestion and more like a warning. Comply or else. But what was the or else? No one ever spelled it out, which only made it worse. It was like living under a cloud. You never knew when it might burst. Then came the complaints about Daniel's truck. He'd parked it in the driveway overnight after working late, and someone reported it for obstructing curb appeal. Obstructing curb appeal. The phrase sounded ridiculous, but the fine wasn't. Every infraction carried a cost, small amounts that added up quickly. At first it was $25 here, $50 there. But soon, the bills started piling up alongside the notes. One evening, as I watered the plants in our front yard, I noticed Mrs. Harper from across the street glaring at me. She lived alone in a pristine white house with perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds arranged in symmetrical patterns. Everything about her screamed perfection, from her neatly pressed blouses to her polished loafers. Word had gotten around that I'd questioned Nancy at the HOA meeting last month, and now everyone treated me like some kind of troublemaker. That night, I snapped. Dinner was tense, the air thick with unspoken frustration. Daniel sat across from me, scrolling through his phone, barely paying attention. Finally, I slammed my fork down on the table. Why does everyone care so much about stupid little things? I burst out, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. It's not like anyone's dying. Daniel looked up, startled. For a moment, he just stared at me, then sighed. Maybe we should try harder to get along. This is supposed to be our home. His words hit harder than I expected. Was I ruining this for us? Or was I the only one who saw how absurd all of this was? I wanted to scream, to tell him that none of this was normal, that no one should have to live like this. But instead, I bit my tongue and nodded, forcing a weak smile. Later, lying awake in bed, I replayed the argument in my head. Daniel didn't understand. He couldn't. To him, the rules were just minor inconveniences, easy enough to follow if it meant keeping the peace. But to me, they felt like chains, binding us tighter and tighter until we couldn't breathe. And worst of all, I couldn't figure out why. Why did these people care so much? What were they afraid of? As the days went by, I started noticing subtle changes, not just in the neighborhood, but in myself. I became hyper-vigilant, double-checking everything before stepping outside. Were the curtains drawn properly? Was the mailbox angled just right? Had I left anything in the driveway that could spark another complaint? The stress gnawed at me, making it hard to focus, hard to sleep. And still, the notes kept coming. Against my better judgment, and maybe a little out of sheer curiosity, I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting. Daniel had begged off, citing work obligations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if these people wanted to play watchdog, I might as well see who was holding the leash. Plus, I figured it wouldn't hurt to put a face to some of the names behind the anonymous notes we'd been receiving. The meeting was held in the community center, a small brick building tucked at the edge of the development. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a podium, where Nancy Whitmore stood chatting with a few other residents. She spotted me almost immediately and gave me that same tight-lipped smile she always wore. "Emily, so glad you could join us," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. It took everything in me not to roll my eyes. I took a seat near the back, scanning the room. There were about 15 people there, most of them older couples or middle-aged women clutching notebooks and pens, like they were preparing for battle. A few glanced at me curiously, whispering behind their hands. I suddenly felt very out of place, like an intruder in their carefully curated world. Nancy began the meeting by going over the usual agenda: landscaping regulations, noise ordinances, parking restrictions. Her tone was calm but firm, each word delivered with practiced precision. As she spoke, I jotted down notes, not because I cared about what she was saying, but because something about her demeanor made me uneasy. She wasn't just explaining rules. She was enforcing a way of life, dictating how everyone should live down to the smallest detail. When she opened the floor for questions, I hesitated before raising my hand. Part of me wanted to stay silent, to blend into the background like I usually did. But another part, the stubborn, increasingly frustrated part, couldn't let this moment pass without speaking up. What happens if someone doesn't follow the rules? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me. Nancy's smile faltered for a split second before snapping back into place. "Well, Emily," she said sweetly, leaning slightly on my name as if to remind me she knew exactly who I was, "we prefer compliance. But if necessary, fines can be issued. Repeated violations may result in further action." "Further action?" I pressed, unable to stop myself. "What does that mean?" Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened ever so slightly. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," she replied smoothly, sidestepping the question entirely. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and I realized no one else seemed bothered by the vague threat hanging in the air. They nodded along, clapping politely when Nancy adjourned the meeting moments later. As I walked home, the weight of the evening settled heavily on my shoulders. Something about Nancy's words lingered, crickling at the back of my mind. Compliance or consequences, that was the unspoken rule here. But what kind of consequences? And who decided where the line was drawn? On the way, I noticed a new sign posted near the entrance to the development. Asterisk asterisk Maplewood, a community committed to excellence. Asterisk asterisk, the word stared back at me, bold and unyielding. Excellence meant conformity here, I realized. Individuality was frowned upon, creativity stifled, and freedom traded for approval. By the time I reached our house, I felt hollow, like I glimpsed something darker beneath the surface of this picture-perfect neighborhood. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were walls, boxing us in tighter and tighter. And the scariest part, no one seemed to care except me. Things escalated quickly after that meeting. The HOA's grip on our lives tightened like a vice, and it felt like every move we made was being scrutinized. Another note arrived, this time complaining about the color of our welcome mat, too bold. Then came complaints about Daniel parking his truck in the driveway overnight. Obstructs curb appeal. Each infraction carried a fine, small at first, but adding up fast. It wasn't just annoying anymore, it was suffocating. One evening, while I was watering the garden, I spotted Mrs. Harper from across the street glaring at me again. She lived alone in her pristine white house with perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds arranged in symmetrical patterns. Everything about her screamed perfection, from her neatly pressed blouses to her polished loafers. Word had gotten around that I'd questioned Nancy at the HOA meeting last month, and now everyone treated me like some kind of troublemaker. That night, I snapped. Dinner was tense, the air thick with unspoken frustration. Daniel sat across from me, scrolling through his phone, barely paying attention. Finally, I slammed my fork down on the table. Why does everyone care so much about stupid little things? I burst out, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. It's not like anyone's dying. Daniel looked up, startled. For a moment, he just stared at me, then sighed. Maybe we should try harder to get along. This is supposed to be our home." His words hit harder than I expected. Was I ruining this for us? Or was I the only one who saw how absurd all of this was? I wanted to scream, to tell him that none of this was normal, that no one should have to live like this. But instead, I bit my tongue and nodded, forcing a weak smile. Later, lying awake in bed, I replayed the argument in my head. Daniel didn't understand. He couldn't. To him, the rules were just minor inconveniences, easy enough to follow if it meant keeping the peace. But to me, they felt like chains, binding us tighter and tighter until we couldn't breathe. And worst of all, I couldn't figure out why. Why did these people care so much? What were they afraid of? As the days went by, I started noticing subtle changes. not just in the neighborhood, but in myself. I became hyper-vigilant, double-checking everything before stepping outside. Were the curtains drawn properly? Was the mailbox angled just right? Had I left anything in the driveway that could spark another complaint? The stress gnawed at me, making it hard to focus, hard to sleep. And still, the notes kept coming. One morning, I found yet another official-looking piece of paper slipped under our door. This one complained about the placement of our outdoor trash cans, which apparently weren't aligned symmetrically with the curb. Symmetry. Seriously. I crumpled the note and threw it away, my hands trembling with anger. But the final straw came when Daniel received a letter at work, a formal warning from the HOA stating that continued violations would result in further action. He came home looking pale, holding the letter like it was a bomb about to go off. This isn't just about fines anymore," he said quietly. "They're threatening legal action if we don't comply." I stared at him, my heart pounding. Legal action. Over a trash can. Over curtains. It was insane, but somehow it felt inevitable. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were asserting control, turning this neighborhood into their own little kingdom where conformity reigned supreme. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give. Either we fought back, or we gave in completely. And I wasn't ready to surrender just yet. My breaking point came when Nancy herself knocked on our door one afternoon. She stood there holding a clipboard, her usual saccharine smile plastered across her face, but there was steel in her voice that sent a chill down my spine. "Emily," she began, her tone overly sweet, "I'm afraid we've had additional reports." She paused for dramatic effect, glancing at her clipboard as if it contained damning evidence. "Your flower beds are encroaching on the sidewalk, and the bike rack in your garage is visible from the street. Both violate HOA guidelines." I stared at her, incredulous. "You're kidding, right? This is insane." My voice rose despite my attempt to stay calm. "The flowers aren't even touching the sidewalk, and since when do people care about seeing a bike rack?" Her smile faltered for a split second before snapping back into place. "I assure you, I take no pleasure in enforcing these rules," she said, though her eyes told a different story. "But consistency is key to maintaining property values." Property values. I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "This isn't about property values. It's about control. You can't dictate every single detail of how we live." Nancy's smile vanished completely now, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "If you'd prefer not to comply, Emily, the consequences will be clear. Repeated violations may result in fines escalating to legal action." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me fuming on the doorstep. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every word Nancy had said replayed in my mind, taunting me. Who gave her the right to decide what was acceptable? What kind of neighborhood policed flower beds and bike racks? It wasn't just ridiculous. It was suffocating. Worse still, Daniel seemed resigned to it all. He kept saying things like, "Maybe we should just try harder to fit in," or "It's easier to follow the rules than fight them." But I couldn't bring myself to agree. Something inside me refused to bow down to their demands. Determined to find answers, I started digging deeper. Late at night, after Daniel went to bed, I pored over old town records and news articles about Maplewood. That's when I stumbled upon something shocking. A lawsuit filed years ago against the HOA alleging harassment and intimidation tactics. Several families claimed they'd been driven out of the neighborhood after refusing to comply with increasingly absurd demands. One family even accused Nancy of orchestrating smear campaigns against them, spreading rumors to turn other neighbors against them, until they felt forced to leave. I showed the article to Daniel the next morning, expecting him to share my outrage. Instead, he frowned, looking uneasy. "Are you sure about this, Em? Maybe those people were exaggerating." His skepticism cut deeper than anything else. Was I truly alone in this fight? Did no one else see how wrong this was? That evening, as I watered the garden, I noticed Mrs. Harper watching me again from her porch. For once, she didn't glare. Instead, she looked almost sad. When our eyes met, she quickly turned away, disappearing behind her screen door. It was strange, unsettling even. Was she afraid of Nancy too? Or was she part of the problem? By the time I went inside, I felt more confused than ever. The HOA wasn't just a set of rules. It was a web of fear and control, ensnaring everyone who lived here. And the worst part, there seemed to be no way out. The tension reached a fever pitch when the HOA declared war, not on us this time, but on an innocent farmer whose only crime was owning a tractor. It started early one morning, just as the sun was rising and casting long shadows across Maplewood Lane. I was sipping coffee at the kitchen table when I heard shouting outside. Curious, I peeked through the blinds to see what all the commotion was about. There, parked in the middle of the street near the entrance of the neighborhood, was Mr. Hargrove's old green tractor. He wasn't even part of the HOA. His farm bordered the development, but he lived miles away from here. Apparently, someone had called 911 because his tractor passed by the entrance while he was hauling hay to his fields. The officers stood awkwardly next to him, clearly unsure why they'd been summoned for something so trivial. Nancy Whitmore arrived shortly after, clipboard in hand and wearing her signature cardigan. She marched up to Mr. Hargrove with that same self-righteous smirk she'd given me countless times. "This is private property," she announced loudly, pointing at the tractor as if it were some kind of alien spacecraft. "We have standards to uphold." "Standards? For a road you don't own?" I shouted before I could stop myself. Heads turned toward me, including Nancy's, but I didn't care anymore. "He's not part of your HOA, Nancy. You can't control everything." Her smile faltered, replaced by a look of thinly veiled anger. "Emily, I suggest you stay out of matters that don't concern you," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the air like glass. But I couldn't stay silent. Neighbors began gathering around, some snapping photos, others shaking their heads disapprovingly. A few whispered among themselves, though none stepped forward to defend Mr. Hargrove. Even Mrs. Harper lingered nearby, clutching her gardening gloves but saying nothing. Mr. Hargrove, bless him, looked both bewildered and furious. "I've been using this road for 20 years, he said firmly, his voice trembling slightly. "No one's ever complained before." "That's because we hadn't formalized our guidelines until recently," Nancy replied smugly, flipping through her clipboard as if it held divine commandments. "If you wish to avoid further issues, I recommend finding another route." The absurdity of it all made my blood boil. This wasn't about rules or aesthetics. It was about power. Nancy and her cronies weren't enforcing guidelines. They were flexing their authority, bullying anyone who dared step out of line. And poor Mr. Hargrove, who had done nothing wrong, was caught in their crosshairs. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I walked over to stand beside him. "You're not going anywhere," I told him firmly, glaring at Nancy. Turning to the crowd, I raised my voice. "Does anyone else think this is ridiculous? We're harassing a man for doing his job, a job that has nothing to do with us." Silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. No one spoke up, not even Mrs. Harper, who quickly retreated into her house. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd pushed too far, exposed myself as the sole rebel in a sea of conformity. But then, a young couple standing off to the side exchanged a glance, their expressions uneasy. Maybe they felt it too, the weight of living under such oppressive rules. In the end, Mr. Hargrove climbed back onto his tractor and drove off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a community divided. As the crowd dispersed, Nancy shot me a look that could freeze fire. "You'll regret this," she muttered under her breath before walking away. That night, Daniel and I sat in silence, the air heavy with unspoken thoughts. Something had shifted, not just between us, but within me. I realized then that staying quiet wasn't an option anymore. If no one else would stand up, I would. Because sometimes, fighting back isn't just about winning. It's about refusing to lose yourself. That night, as Daniel and I sat in silence, the weight of everything pressed down on us like a storm cloud. The fight with Nancy, the tractor incident, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that finally clicked into place. This wasn't just about rules or property values. It was about control, plain and simple. And I couldn't live like that anymore. I think we need to leave, I said quietly, breaking the stillness between us. Daniel looked at me, startled. Leave? Just because of this? He gestured vaguely toward the window, as if the neighborhood itself might overhear us. Yes, I replied firmly. This isn't our home anymore. Not really. It hasn't been for a while. For once, he didn't argue. Maybe he'd seen it too, the way the HOA squeezed the life out of everyone who lived here, turning neighbors into informants and friends into strangers. Or maybe he just saw how exhausted I was, how much this place had worn me down. We listed the house the next day. Word spread quickly among the neighbors, though no one dared say anything directly to us. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others whispered behind closed doors. Nancy left one last note, this time congratulating us on finding a better fit elsewhere. I threw it away without reading it. On moving day, the truck groaned under the weight of our belongings as movers loaded box after box. I stood in the driveway, watching them work, when I noticed Mrs. Harper peeking through her curtains. Her face was unreadable, but there was something in her expression, a flicker of sadness, maybe even regret. Was she envious of our freedom, or did she pity us for giving up? As we pulled away from the curb for the last time, I glanced back at Maplewood Lane. The houses looked the same as they always had, neat, orderly, suffocating. But now, they seemed smaller somehow, less imposing. For months, they'd loomed over us like prison walls. But today, they felt distant, powerless. We were leaving, and there was nothing they could do to stop us. The drive out of town was quiet, both of us lost in thought. Daniel reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. Do you think we'll find somewhere better? He asked softly. I nodded, feeling lighter than I had in months. We have to. Somewhere people don't care so much about stupid little things. Somewhere we can breathe. Days turned into weeks, and eventually we settled into a new home, a cozy little house on the edge of a small town. There was no HOA here, no rulebook dictating every detail of our lives. Our neighbors waved hello instead of glaring, and kids rode bikes freely down the street without fear of being reported. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. But even now, months later, I sometimes think about Maplewood Lane and the people who stayed behind. Did they ever question the rules? Did they ever wonder what it would be like to break free? Or were they content living in their perfect little bubble, oblivious to the cost of conformity? One thing I know for sure, I'll never forget the lesson I learned there. Rules aren't meant to control, they're meant to guide. And when they start doing the opposite, it's time to walk away. Because home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's a feeling. And for the first time in a long time, I finally feel like I'm home.